That's okay, isn't it, Karen, if we record this? Okay.
I'll try not to say anything I regret.
Okay. All right, everyone. I'm Mark Roth. Hope you can hear me okay. I'm one of the founders of the Appalachian Science Communicators, and we're so thrilled today to have Karen Weintraub as our special guest to talk about her career path and any other questions that you might have. Before we get started, I'll just mention a couple of things to you. We are a group of science communicators. A lot of our core members are in public information with either Pitt or UPMC or other universities. We also have a number of freelancers. My own background, I'm semi-retired from the newspaper industry. And what I think will make today's presentation intriguing is that Karen kind of has had a foot in both worlds of freelance and newspaper staff writing, and we'll ask her about that as well. We encourage any of you who aren't members already, right now you're in a window where we don't have membership fees, so you can sign up on the Facebook page very easily, and we would love to have more people join us as part of this ongoing effort. So I'm going to get started. Karen's bio was posted on the site, but the real short version is that for several years, she was a top freelancer, and I say that from my own perspective, printing articles in everything from Scientific American to the New York Times. And then in the last couple of years has become the main, I think, medical writer or a primary health writer for USA Today, starting out covering the pandemic, but then branching into other things. So I will ask you, Karen, to sort of just chart for us your evolution into this line of work. How did that all happen?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me. Appreciate the invitation. And nice to sort of meet you all as blank screens. I'm happy to see faces if anybody wants to put their cameras on. So I should say that thank you, Anna, and Abby. I should say that I have almost no background in science. Like many science journalists, I was an art history and urban studies major in college. Did as little science as I could get away with. But I was working at the Boston Globe editing City Hall coverage and State House coverage, and I wasn't having a great time. And so I looked around the room and said, where else do I want to be? And I'm in Boston, and health and science is the lifeblood of this region. And so I thought, well, why not? Let's see. And I started editing the weekly health and science section under an editor who knew a lot, so it was okay that I didn't. And I learned on the job. I then spent what I describe as 9 months in paradise on a fellowship at the Knight Science Journalism Foundation, which if anybody ever has the opportunity to do, I say do, and call me because I live nearby. And took the biology class I never took in college, and a few other things that I can talk about if anybody cares. But it was really wonderful, and it helped give me a little more, I guess, confidence in science. And then instead of going back to the Globe, I made a mistake. It was during the 2009 economic crisis, and I bailed for PR, thinking that it was more secure, and it did not. It was a job that did not work out for me. And 6 months later, I was reborn as a freelance writer, and I did that for a dozen years, as Mark said, working increasingly for bigger and bigger publications, more national publications generally, which I can talk about, and then landed at USA Today in May of 2020. I applied before the pandemic, and by the time I was hired, we were mid-pandemic. So I'm one of team of, I think there are 5 of us, something like that, 4 now. So 4 or 5 people, depending on the moment, who cover health, and 2 of us primarily doing the pandemic. So that's where things stand now.
You know, I'd given you some questions ahead of time, but one that just now occurred to me is, I know when I started out, I sort of had a similar experience of not beginning in science writing and then switching into it because I had an interest. And I know fairly early on for me, and I won't bore people with the story, but there was a particular experience I had that really kind of hooked me in. When you were first starting out, were there particular stories you remember that really made you feel like I've made the right choice? This is where I want to be.
I mean, weirdly, what comes to mind when you're talking is I had small children at the time, and explaining the machinations of Boston City Council to a 4-year-old didn't work. But talking about whales and the sky and, biology, I could, it just felt more relevant, I guess, to the life that I was leading at the time.
Right,
So that's
right.
really what grabbed me, I guess. And obviously the human drama involved in health stories is, second to none, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. So unlike you, I have only kind of dabbled in freelance writing since I retired from newspapers. But I remember talking to you once and you sort of saying, this is what I do to make a living. I'm trying to create a living salary for myself by doing this, which I think is very challenging in today's landscape. But talk to me about how you developed that business.
Yeah, I would say it's very challenging. Marry well is kind of my best advice there. Um, because having somebody in the household with a steady income is very helpful, because freelance income waxes and wanes. I started teaching at the same time, just so I would have a guaranteed something coming in every month. So I suggest, if you're going to go full-time freelance, to have some other gig on the side. You don't want it to be something that's so involved that you can't make that call that you want to make for the freelance story, but something where there is money, at least something coming in on the side. I freelanced twice in my life. The first time when I was 24, I guess. I moved to Houston to my then boyfriend, now husband, was going to grad school, and I had lined up a job before we left. And while I was driving across the country with all of my belongings, they laid me off. Which I was, yeah. Anyway, expletives deleted there. But so I arrived in a totally foreign city, not knowing anyone or anything, and needing to make a living. It was a lot harder that time, I would say. It was a lot easier the second time. I had spent 8 years at the Boston Globe, so I knew what the Globe wanted. And I started freelancing for them pretty quickly. I had a friend who was then at USA Today and started freelancing for them. But I would say one of the sort of dominant features of my freelance, and I freelanced for 11 years, I think. And it felt like every 18 months or so, I had to reinvent myself. My main client, so one day USA Today decides, oh, we don't want freelancers anymore. And that was, I had made a substantial chunk of money from them the year before, and all of a sudden that was gone. I had covered Ebola and some other things for National Geographic, and one day they decided, oh, we don't, Ebola's over, we don't want to cover that anymore, we're not covering health. And I was like, I cover other things too, but I never got another piece in National Geographic on their website. And it just so every 18 months, I felt like I needed to find a new primary outlet. I think what saved me or helped me was knowing what I do well, I guess, and knowing what I like. So I'm good at turning stories quickly, which not everybody likes. So I did a lot of the study routine. I covered a lot of breaking studies for scientificamerican.com, for Nat Geo for a while.com, for the Globe sometimes. So that was helpful, that I can turn the people who write wonderful magazine stories, but can only write 6 or 8 a year. I don't know how they make a living. I couldn't do that. Maybe in the 70s, when the fee was the same as it is now, that was a livable wage, but I don't think that's livable anymore. And if that's your strength, that's wonderful, but I think you need a day job to balance that. So, look for whatever your strength is, I think can help, or what you like can help determine kind of what kind of freelancer to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I didn't know that about the quick turnaround, but that makes perfect sense to me. And I can imagine that would be a really important niche, because I think a lot of people who do dwell in the freelance world maybe aren't quite as adept at that. And that's where maybe the newspaper training, among other things, helps out.
Right.
I think the first time you and I met was on a panel in Pittsburgh talking about autism. So a related question is, I know at that point we were both writing a lot of autism stories, or a fair number. Were there certain subjects? I mean, you mentioned the Ebola, but were there certain other things besides autism that sort of became fortes for you?
Yeah. So, yes, but it changes over time also.
Hmm.
So I think, and I noticed this actually mostly in my teaching. When I first started teaching around 2010, I guess, everybody was interested in neuroscience and they all wanted to go into neuroscience and write about neuroscience. And then there was a food phase for a while. And now obviously there's been infectious disease, autoimmunity, things like that. And so I've tried to be a little bit ahead of that to see what's coming and jump in quickly so that I can build expertise before that. So I had, for instance, expertise in infectious diseases before, or had, as I said, I covered Ebola before I moved, before the pandemic hit. So I had some background there. I think if you write a lot, if you're out there, you can see that coming, which is helpful. The autism expertise, which I actually was just thinking I haven't written much about lately, came because, as I said, when I was reborn as a freelance writer, I didn't have any work. And so I accepted an offer to help an autism doctor at Harvard write a book, and co-wrote that with her. And I would say the only thing that pays worse than daily journalism is book writing. So think long and hard before you do that, but it was good experience. And so I knew a lot about autism from that experience.
Great. Tell us a little bit about the teaching you have done or continue to do.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it depends on what your interest is and what your strength is. And I am super lucky to be in the Boston area, and where I live, Harvard is one way and MIT is the other and BU is that way. So all of which I should say pay substantially better than the typical wage for an adjunct. I think it's like $2,000 across the country. And I make around between 7 and 8, depending on the school. So, you know, I'm super lucky, and I try to appreciate that fact. But so adjuncting isn't for everyone. It can be a ton of work. Also, if you have a, 25-person class and you have to grade papers every week, I don't, again, that may be the only thing worse than daily journalism in terms of income. So you just really have to think, maybe you're a really good editor and you could edit a corporate website or something on the side. Just think about kind of what your strengths are and your interests and play to that. And the regional strengths, like I said, I'm lucky to be surrounded by educational institutions here. So.
And are you teaching basic writing, science writing? What kinds of courses are you teaching?
All of the above.
All of the above.
So I taught for 8 years in the science writing master's program at Boston University, may it rest in peace. And I also taught alternate semesters at Harvard Extension, which is sort of the back door into Harvard. It's a night school kind of thing. And that started in person, which was really fun to walk into a Harvard classroom. It's like, this is my classroom at Harvard, but it's all gone virtual since then. And there I taught a lot of, I've taught, what have I taught? I've taught, I guess, freelance, freelance writing, news. No, I think I only did freelance writing and feature writing and science writing there. So I taught news writing in the BU program, and now I'm teaching at MIT. I've taught, this is my second year in the master's program for science writing, and I've also taught undergrads there in last semester was science writing in contemporary society. So whatever that
sounds very profound. Yeah.
Yes. It was fun.
How did the USA Today job emerge, and how did you come to make that decision? Did you have trepidation about that?
Yes. I, as I mentioned, had friends there. This is, as you probably have all experienced, this is a small industry. Don't make enemies. I had been, a former colleague had been there, and through her, I had met somebody else. They were looking for an editor a year or so ago. She had reached out to me. It was right after I had taken a 1-year gig at BU. So I said, thanks, but no thanks. She called me a year later and said, hey, we've got a reporting opening. Would you be interested? And I said, at that point, this was probably January or February of 2020. Again, maybe this is TMI, but that child who had been very small when I moved over to science writing was off to college, and I was feeling like I was needed some socialization again after years at the dining room table. And so I had been looking or thinking that it might be time to join back up with an institution. In some ways, it's more stable. I mean, they promised me weekends. I can't say I've had every one of them since I started, but it's been a little better than freelancing. You know, I always thought in a way that being a freelancer was more secure in some ways, because I knew I could always go to a different outlet if one dried up. Whereas now, God forbid, USA Today, knock on wood, goes under, I'm in trouble. But you know, I will have to find a job very quickly. So it's a trade-off, I guess, either way. But that was why I was ready to move.
Now, I spent most of my career on a newspaper, so I'm familiar in a general way with that. And one thing I think about from that is that, I mean, I was very fortunate to have a lot of autonomy on my newspaper in terms of what stories I worked on, but a lot of newspaper people don't. And I would think a possible trade-off between the freelancing, where you're trying to pick things that are saleable, but they're still things that interest you, and a staff job is you may be asked to do things that you wouldn't have chosen otherwise. So how has that balance worked out for you?
Right. Well, again, I have gotten exceedingly lucky. And to some degree, you know, I could have had other opportunities over the 10 years I freelanced and turned them down, in part because I didn't see that possibility. And because I got expensive, because I actually was doing well as a freelancer. So I took the job in part because I had a probably 10-minute conversation with my editor and liked her. And it turned out that instinct was right. And I never thought I would say the sentence, but I really like her. I like working for her. She just last week got promoted, so I'm kind of upset and trying to figure out, you know, how my world is going to change now. But it's been really great to have a consistent person in my camp helping me get, you know, supporting me and giving me leeway when she can. You know, obviously there's always stuff that comes down from upstairs, and you know, with the pandemic, there were some stories I didn't have much choice about, but it's hard to argue with covering the topic that has dominated world news for the last 2 years. So it wasn't like I was trying to escape covering COVID. Just before we got on, there's boosters for kids are likely to be approved potentially, possibly in the next 2 days. So I was just pre-writing a story about that. You know, is that my dream story? No, but it needs to be done. So I don't have a problem kicking that out.
Right. You know, this makes me think that I think just in the last week or so, I saw a Twitter note from Ed Yong, who, for people who don't know, is top. Just won the Pulitzer, I think, last year, and has specialized in a lot of COVID coverage. But I think the thrust of the note was, I'm going on leave because I'm completely burned out. I'm wondering, with your experience having covered COVID, did you have similar feelings? How has the burden of that been for you?
Right now, I'm mostly envious that he can afford to take 6 weeks. But no, I mean, I'm pretty good at balance. I do find myself every once in a while saying I need a happy story, you know, and finding something where I'm thinking about doing a story now about a kid whose life was saved by surgery right after his birth, you know. So like, I feel like medicine gives you that opportunity, and science, the fascination of science. And I feel like, as depressing as COVID was, especially the politics around COVID has been super depressing, that the science itself to me is energizing and interesting, and there's progress there. And so that has helped me through, and I also have a terrific family, which has helped. So I don't feel what Ed feels.
Right. Right. You've also been able to have some variety. And I know one of the most recent things you did that you and I talked about was you had this big multi-part series on the science of obesity, which was great, by the way, for anyone who hasn't read it.
It's behind a paywall, so message me, I'll send it to you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just if you didn't hear that, folks, it is behind a paywall, but if you want to read it, Karen will make sure it gets to you. And do we have, what's the best way to contact you? I guess I should ask that if people are going to reach out. Okay. All right. So at any rate, how did that arise? Was that your idea? Did it come from previous work you had done, or how did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, that one actually did come from my editor, who was sometime in 2020 said, or 2021 said, at some point next year, we need to do something on obesity. I don't know what it is, but something. And I started looking at it, and some of that coverage came out of my frustration, because I feel like I've written the same story for 20 years that, oh, just lose weight. Well, who loses weight and keeps it off? The answer is almost nobody. And so why do we keep giving people the same advice to lose weight when nobody can? And so some of that series came from my frustration as to why we haven't made any progress in that area. And yet we keep saying the same thing. And there are new medications now that are coming out that seem to be incredibly effective, 25% weight loss in the latest study. But it costs $1,300 a month. And insurance won't cover it. Oh, thanks. Insurance won't cover it unless you're already diabetic or have other severe health problems. So we mock people for being fat. We criticize them, and yet we offer them nothing. Or the same advice just frustrates people and doesn't give them a way out. So that sort of was where I started from with that series, trying to understand why that is, why we haven't made more progress.
Right. And I think that kind of critical passion came through in the series. One of the things that, and I don't want to overdwell on this particular series, but one of the things that I think you raised that a lot of other kind of science writing on obesity doesn't raise is sort of the policy and systemic issues about the food industry. And a lot of times those pieces tend to be written by people with a very strong advocacy viewpoint. And I really appreciated you kind of diving into it as a science writer. But can you talk a little bit about those forces being at play?
Well, I just revealed my advocacy there, but I mean, I did feel like policy has failed in a sense, and I wanted to explain a little bit about that. Marion Nessel at NYU has been, some would say ranting, but talking about that for decades. And I spent some time talking to her. And I felt it was frustrating to me that the federal government, again, has been talking about the need to lose weight, but not really offering anything. I had to restrain myself a little bit because I could have gone sort of really off the deep end on that. There was actually a terrific story. I'm trying to remember who wrote it, about how the pace of the FDA work on food has been abysmal. It's like 25 years. They've been promising this one report that they still haven't provided. And so I tried to stay away from direct policy, but like that, but clearly there are policy issues affecting it, affecting obesity and food policy. So I dipped my toe in, but I didn't get fully in. I should say also that series did really well with readers. We've been having a push for subscriptions at USA Today, which is why that series, or it's a 6-day series. I think 4 of the days are behind the paywall. And that got more subscriptions than I think anything they've done so far.
Yeah.
And we sort of looked at that and said, okay, why? What did that do? And how do we do it again? And so I'm now working on a series, don't tell anyone, about pain. Because to me, that's another thing that's ubiquitous. 1/3 of American adults are in pain, have chronic pain. And yet, because it's so ubiquitous, we don't really write about it very much.
Right.
And so I'm trying to take sort of a 360 view of pain and pain relief. And obviously, a lot of it also is tied to the opioid epidemic, because people ended up on opioids in large part because they were in pain. So,
Yes. Sounds terrific. And you know, it reminds me of some things I've read, you know, that I'm sure you're familiar with, where there's this sort of ongoing debate about what is news, what deserves to be news. And I don't think science writing is unique in this regard, that there's been debate about always chasing the latest new wrinkle, the latest unusual or counterintuitive finding. But there have been some really good people who have written about how, why can't news be the thing that actually affects the most people in their day-to-day lives? And why do we shy away from that as the very definition of news? It seems in a way that that's part of what you're tapping into by writing about obesity and pain.
I'm trying to, yes. I would say, again, I'm very lucky that I'm technically on an enterprise team. So while I do a lot of breaking news, the point of the team is to sort of go beyond just breaking news. So talking a little out of school here, but earlier today, for instance, we have a team of reporters whose job it is to chase the latest thing. And CNN had a story up earlier about a study that frankly, I don't think was a very good study, but they wrote a piece about it. Our folks did too, because CNN had it and people were talking about it. I am, like I said, in a very lucky position that I don't have to do that. The reason I don't think it was a very good study is it said that people can lose weight if they exercise, if they walk 11,000 steps a day. Well, 11,000 steps a day is like 5 miles, which anybody who has the time to walk 5 miles a day is probably healthier than the average person. And B, anybody who can walk 5 miles a day is probably healthier than the average person. So the idea that walking was what made them healthier doesn't make sense to me. So I personally was really happy not to have to cover that. And I wish that we as journalists could not cover that. But readers like to read those kinds of stories, I guess. So we do them. But yes, I am trying to, and again, in a very lucky position where I can try to add more value than just here's the latest study.
Yeah. Another aspect of this that I wanted to ask you about, I guess it's because I brought up Ed Yong, but I remember, you know, I was following his stuff about COVID, obviously, and then at a certain point, and I think these were the stories that led to his Pulitzer, he kind of did something that I never would have been able to do in a newspaper setting, which was really to sort of write almost advocacy or opinion pieces, or they really blended, you know, a very strong viewpoint and a very strong criticism of government policy and government preparation with the science itself. I would think that you would face the same kind of challenges in writing about things like the obesity situation. So how is that for you? I mean, would you be able to write the kind of pieces he wrote, or are you in a setting where you have to stop short of that?
Did I mention envy? Yeah. No, I don't think I could have. And I think that a lot of the value of his stories was that he could write one a month and he could take a step back and say, okay, in this last 30, 60 days, what's happened and what can we make of it? I was writing 3 to 5 stories a week. I couldn't do that.
Right.
And I think there's a place for both. I think, you know, a magazine, Legacy Magazine, is the right place for those sort of step back thought pieces. But I also think you need to report when a new booster is approved or whatever in the daily newspaper. I do try very hard not to editorialize in my stories. I mean, again, I did sort of betray my position on the obesity epidemic, but I think it comes from a place of of knowing the topic and
Mhm.
covering the topic. It doesn't come from, it comes from reporting and
Mhm.
also personal experience. And so I try to stick to that. And I spoke to 50 people for that series.
Mhm.
So it was not just the world according to me,
Mhm.
which I feel very strongly about not doing. Yes.
Right. I think you tell me how this strikes you, but I think for people in our part of the news industry, when we get impassioned about something, one way we deal with that passion is in the topic we choose to cover in the first place, and the kind of people we lift up for for the public to be aware of. So going back to the autism example, I think when we met, it was right after I had written about a family that had a couple of grown sons who were severely autistic or profoundly autistic. And it came partly out of a conviction that those kind of families were not getting much coverage.
Mhm.
You know, that you were getting a lot of coverage of the high functioning Aspergery kind of autism
The
people, but
weird people, but right.
yeah, who were highly accomplished
Right.
and could communicate for themselves.
Right.
These young men didn't even have language, let alone toilet training. At any rate, so it wasn't a matter of, in my case, of writing in an editorial or opinionated way, but it was a matter of lifting up a subject or an approach that might have been ignored. Do you feel like that's part of what you were doing with obesity and other topics?
Yeah, totally agree. I think that one of the things I discovered with the obesity series, more than I think with anything else I've ever reported, is how siloed people were. So
Mm.
the nutritionist said, you've got to eat right to lose weight. The endocrinologists were, you've got to be medicated to lose weight. The surgeons, you've got a surgery to lose. And there was so little, there was nobody really who was pulling the pieces together. And I felt in a way that really made me uncomfortable, actually, that I had to do that much more in that story than
Mhm.
in almost anything else I've ever written.
Mhm.
And even that to me says something about that world,
Yeah.
like, that nobody is doing that. Maybe explains why we haven't made more progress. I don't know,
Right.
but
Well, before we open it up to others in the group, I have one final question, which is just to sort of, if people were thinking about a freelance career, and I mean, I could bring up the staff writing job, but I know those are so scarce now that I think the freelance thing is more available.
right.
What are some of the main pieces of advice you would give from your many years of experience?
Number one is get paid. Um, a plumber would not fix your toilet for nothing, and I think that we devalue ourselves by not getting paid and not getting paid enough. But I mean, we never get paid enough, but I do think that it's important. The HuffPo, I don't even know if they still follow this, but they're old, well, people will see you, you'll get visibility. You can't eat visibility.
Mhm.
And I'm morally opposed to doing this. I think this work requires skill and ability, and I resent people doing it for nothing.
And in that regard, do you
Yeah,
have a kind of a personal threshold that you adopted as your floor?
yeah. Again, I mean, I was very, very lucky.
Mm.
But I would say I certainly, after a couple of years, I wouldn't work for less than 50 cents a word.
Mm.
Um, and the other thing that I found, so different places pay different amounts.
Mhm.
And even within the papers, I mean, when I worked at the Boston Globe, the travel section always paid twice as much as we could offer in the news section, or more than twice. And so different sections of different papers pay differently. If I write for a website versus the Atlantic's website once offered me $125 for a 1,200 word story.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
said, thanks. But again, I was in a privileged position. If it had been my first clip, maybe I would have done that one. But to me, that's insulting, again,
Mhm.
as a professional,
Mhm.
for a major publication. So, thinking about which outlet it is, what part of the outlet. If the New Yorker asks you to write, yeah, I would write for NewYorker.com personally, even though they pay less than the magazine. But that's, one has one's own goals and thresholds, I guess.
Yes.
But generally, newspapers generally pay between 25 and 50 cents a word. New York Times pays closer to 75 cents. And I sort of inched my way up over the decade, where I started more local, and then national publications tend to pay better. So I gravitated there as much as I could.
I mean, that's actually interesting for me to hear, because I don't know that world as well, but I'm finding writing, as I do mainly for institutional publications, that $1 a word is pretty standard. So it might actually be that there's a trade-off there. You're not going to get the exposure or the readership you would with a national publication, but you might actually be able to earn a decent living by writing by these specialized publications.
Absolutely. University publications are great. Alumni publications, sometimes corporate publications, although you may not want your name on that. If you're also, I made a decision early on that I was going to try to stick with journalism. And so I turned down anything that didn't fit in mainstream journalism for me. And not everybody makes that decision, and that's totally fine. But I was trying to stick there, and I'm sure I could have made more money if I didn't do that. But I was doing okay enough sticking with journalism that I didn't make that. And I felt like my value to corporations, for instance, was because of my journalism, and so that felt like a conflict.
Yeah. So I interrupted you. So that's point number one that you would emphasize. What else?
Oh, I think that was 1 through 3. What else?
You said get paid.
Get paid, go national if you can. Think about who you're writing for, the conflicts of interest issue, the money versus conflicts of interest, areas of expertise and interest. I mean, to me, why do we write, right? We write mostly because we feel the need to write. We want to write. So why write stuff you don't want to write? I had a student once who was writing, I don't know, real estate in Canada stuff, and she was like, I hate this. I really want to write about environment. So I was like, well, then maybe you shouldn't be writing about real estate, whatever. Just like, especially if it's not your full-time job, or if it's a side thing. To me, do what you love then, in particular.
And I would suppose in her example that if she had any notion that, well, this is for my resume, I'm not sure how much crossover value there is. I mean, between that and the things she actually wanted to write about.
Right.
Yeah.
She would slip an occasional story in that fit both. But
yeah.
It
Can I ask whether anyone else, particularly from our core group at AppSciComm, but anyone would have any other questions? Allison, yeah.
Yeah, I like to be the first to raise my hand. Thank you so much for talking with us, Karen. This is really great and really educational. I'm curious, I know you've talked about freelancing for different outlets and the pay, and that is kind of a determining factor, but I'm also curious about the editors and the culture and the environment, and if there's somewhere you would recommend them more so, and it isn't necessarily just because of the pay.
Yeah. So I don't mean this to sound as snotty as it might come across, but I really like writing for the New York Times because people call you back quickly, and you can be much more efficient when people call you back quickly. So that was another reason that I liked writing for top national publications. And the editors were generally nice and good. So I felt comfortable writing for those people. Did I learn a tremendous amount? Maybe not, but I liked writing for them. So yes, the quality of the editing and the quality of the editor is something that was important to me as well. Although you can't always pick that. Oftentimes, I preferred editors who left my stuff alone. And that's actually something. So I did occasionally write for magazines, especially Scientific American. One story comes to mind where I think she assigned it in October. I finished it at the end of November, and it ran not that February, but the February after that, like over a year later. And she revised it completely twice, like 100%. And I essentially had to re-report the piece 3 times. And I got paid well for it, but it was so frustrating and so it took so much time that actually by the word count, my pay was better on the 50 cent a word newspaper article than it was for the $1.25, whatever it was, $1.50 word count I got for the magazine. So that's something else to think about, is what's the process? And I've had students and people where the editor is such a pain in the butt, frankly, that it's not worth writing for them, or you don't trust how they're going to play your stories. I loved writing for nationalgeographic.com because they were so beautiful. The photos were so nice. And I feel so proud when my story would appear under this gorgeous photo. So, I mean, that's kind of a personal thing, obviously, but up to you.
Thank you. Did you have a follow-up, Allison, on that?
I could, but I'm not going to dominate. I see
Okay.
the hands. Go ahead.
Okay. Anna, I think you were next.
Yeah, well, you sort of answered one of my questions that I had, which was about kind of making the decision with staying fully in journalism as you're freelancing, or making a switch to working with commercial clients or with companies, and how you determine the change. And it sounds like it's kind of a personal, weighing your personal reasons and pay, and kind of making the decision for yourself. But the other question I was wondering is, you mentioned that you had a very short stint in PR, and 6 months later you left. So I'm just curious, why that didn't work out for you, and just your thoughts on this in general.
I would say more if we were not recording.
I can follow up later.
Let's just say it was not a productive experience for me or I took a job that was over my head, so that was my fault. I thought I was ready for it, and I wasn't. And they promised me that they wouldn't hold it against me, and they would educate me, and they didn't, and they held it against me instead, in my feeling. So I didn't feel supported. I felt the opposite. And I did quit. I was not fired, but I might have been had I stayed. So I got out ahead of time. I will say that people who followed me in that job spent many hours in therapy after that. So it was that was a bad situation. Would I do it again? Potentially, but I would try. I did not follow my instincts on that one, and I should have.
So it wasn't like a major kind of personal crisis when you were like, oh no, like PR is definitely not for me. It was more of like situational and working with particular people.
Yeah, I would say the one sort of personal crisis I had in doing that was that I didn't anticipate, was I was working for a research institute, and the communications aspect was ancillary to their mission. And I felt, as somebody who had always worked in journalism where the story was the mission, it felt very disconcerting to me to be in that sort of secondary position. I don't know if it was just ego, but it didn't feel fulfilling to me to be in that role personally. And I also, there was nobody to talk to. It wasn't like a newsroom environment where everybody had similar interests or even paid attention to the news. So socially it was challenging.
Thank you for answering.
Yeah. Erin?
This was a really fascinating conversation. And I love how you made a point about not writing for free, because I think that this is something that a lot of folks struggle with, especially breaking in as freelancers. I worked as a freelance science journalist at the tail end of my PhD as a way to transition from science into science writing. And it was really hard to break in and get those first clips without accepting those really crappy pay rates. It's funny you mentioned the Atlantic, because I wrote that story. I wrote that 1,200 word feature for I think $125, because I needed the exposure. But I was curious to hear your thoughts on, should we all be boycotting those pubs in order to, rise all the, raise the tide and lift all the boats? And then if so, how do folks really break in, if not essentially writing for free in the beginning?
Right. I mean, I guess personally, I would write for Atlantic or that level publication like 3 times to get those clips, and then that would be it, you know, at that level. In terms of boycotting, I mean, it's tempting, but there's always somebody else who just got their PhD or just got out of undergrad and wants to write those stories. So it's very hard to take a stand like that, I guess. You know, but I wouldn't do it more than 3 times. I guess, you know, I would get what you need out of it, what benefits you personally, and then I would move on.
Yeah, so it sounds like they have a place. Is that kind of your recommendation for somebody who's maybe trying to take that leap now?
I mean, if you have no clips and you need a clip, you know, maybe do that, but you're probably better off going to a lesser read publication, like, I don't know, well, Undark, if you're familiar with that, put out by the Night Science Journalism folks, or Aeon. Nautilus has had a problem paying people at one point, so I would check on that before you sign on there. But somewhere where you can have a little more freedom and write a little longer and get hopefully good editing. And those, I mean, Undark, for instance, does pay very well. I don't know what the readership is, but so, you know, if you can get a clip where you're paid reasonably, I would go there instead. And I certainly wouldn't dwell in the places that don't respect you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Deborah.
Hi, this is not my question, but I have actually written for Undark. And they were really good, though I will say, you know, part of the deal with Undark, which I think is kind of in a transition, is you don't get your name on the article, right? It's all anonymous.
Really?
Yeah. And yeah, so, but you're allowed, if you want to later, to reveal it. I think after, I can't remember how many days, maybe 90 days or something.
Really? Weird.
But yeah, at least that's what it was when I wrote for them.
Okay.
And it was good. It was somewhat freeing that you could write about, like in my case, I was writing about electric vehicles, right? And that a lot of people think electric vehicles are great, but they're not really as good as people think they are
Right.
from a climate perspective, right? In any case, so that's just kind of an FYI. But I did get a note from them the other day that said they were, I think they're renaming or something themselves. They're kind of changing their business model. But in any case, so what my question is, so I'm an engineer by trade, and so I get offered primarily from like PR kinds of organizations, like a free trip to someplace, with the hope that I will write an article about it. And I did this once for the Japan Prize. It was really interesting. And I wrote an op-ed about it. It was about soil and absorbing CO2 and so forth. The one that never actually happened because of COVID, but I took it because I'm just like so curious, because as an engineer, you know, I'm just a curious person by nature, was a company that was actually based in Russia, in Siberia. And they produce aluminum from renewable sources. So that to me is a very interesting concept. And I thought, okay, well, I could really do something interesting, connect what's happening there in Russia with like what's happening here in Pittsburgh, you know, with aluminum production and so forth here. So it did not happen because of COVID. And now, of course, it's never going to happen. I never want to go to Russia or Siberia. But I'm curious if you got those kinds of offers and what you thought about them. You know, basically you're writing for free for a trip to an interesting location.
Yeah, this may be unpopular, but I don't like those. I don't think they're really ethical, because I think there's a quid pro quo expected, even if they don't say we want you to write about us. I think they do expect that. I've been offered Tel Aviv University, I think, pays for American journalists to go to Tel Aviv to interview their researchers. And, you know, when I turned them down, they said, well, we've had people from the New York Times accept our funding, whatever. I don't know. I didn't check it out, but to me, it doesn't feel right. I mean, but I'm old fashioned about that stuff. So I think that's a personal decision, I guess I would say. I do think you have to disclose that. But I'm not in whatever you write. I think it is important to say this trip was funded by X, but I don't know. I just sort of feel like if it's worth covering, it's worth somebody, it's worth your institution or an institution paying for your trip. But I have missed out because I hold those beliefs, but I'm still there.
Are there any others who have questions?
Looks like Abby has a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Karen. I had a question about your experience getting into sort of teaching as well. I mean, I think that is such a specific skill set that it doesn't always mean just because you're a great writer doesn't mean that you're going to be a great teacher of writing. So I'm just curious, how did you first get involved with it? And, how did you, sort of make that transition or sort of build that skill set?
Yeah, well, first I should admit that the first journalism class I ever walked into, I was teaching. So I never took a journalism class. And when I was offered the class after about a year after I started asking for it, I immediately went to somebody who I knew had graduated from journalism school and said, will you share this class with me? Because I don't know what I'm doing. So that was helpful. The first year or two, I co-taught that class. I would say that you have to, with teaching, in my experience, it's mostly instinct. You don't get a lot of feedback from the faculty, from whoever your boss is. I've had people look over my syllabus, but that's about it. And I don't even know, it was like a check mark. I didn't get any feedback. So you have to have, you have to be cocky, I guess, overconfident. I don't know. Have faith in yourself to do it once and try it and see how it goes. A lot of places, unfortunately, are willing to take a chance on adjuncts because they're so low paid and because the universities are desperate. But I would say that I've learned by doing, and I've learned by reaching out to other people and talking to friends who teach and asking them about it and asking the students what they want and what they've gotten out of it. I find undergrads harder than grads, that they're sort of less professionally oriented, but they show up less to class. But that just may be me and my whatever. But I actually really enjoyed. I surprised myself by enjoying this science writing and society class last year because it was the first time I've taught students who only one person in the class actually wanted to be a journalist. The others were scientists. And I got what I consider the best compliment of my career, if I may brag, about that, which is a guy who is headed to a PhD at Stanford in stem cell biology, said he had never before been forced to think about the public implications of his work. In 4 years at MIT as a stem cell scientist, nobody had said, hey, the public is going to support you in your science and you need to think about how they perceive that. So to me, that just screamed the fact that scientists need public education, need what we have to offer, which is the understanding of what public interest, where the public interest is and what people care about and how to talk to the public so that they'll understand. So I think we have something to offer if you're comfortable in front of a classroom. Part of why I wanted to teach was I had sat at a desk as an editor for 8 years and I was like, I'm afraid to talk to people anymore. And so I wanted to kind of confront that challenge and get out there and start talking again. So it is not my natural state. I'm shaking actually at the moment, but but yeah, I think it's good practice.
Did you
Thanks.
have any follow-ups, Abby, on that?
No,
Okay.
I have definitely gone in front of a group of undergrads just to give a guest talk, and it is an intimidating experience for
I think
sure.
high school would be worse, but yeah.
So if I could ask a follow-up, Karen,
Sure.
so I've had that experience and I completely relate to what you're saying about not getting much internal feedback from other faculty or administrators or whatever. But at Carnegie Mellon, where I taught, it is routine for you to get student feedback. I tried to create some of my own, but there's also a built-in system for that. I assume you have that at the places you've taught as well. And I've heard other people in that position say that they find student evaluations to be a mixed blessing. So what's your own experience been on that, in that regard?
Yeah, now that you say that, I haven't gotten it at MIT, so I have no idea what
Oh,
they think of me.
okay.
But at BU we did do it. And one of the things that people said, for instance, I have slides that I present every week, and I mostly do it because I have a tendency to go off topic. And so if I have slides, it keeps me organized. But I did get a criticism once that I go off topic too much. So I do say at the beginning of every semester now that it's okay, that I know that I'm going to go off topic and that I have these slides to keep me on, and that we'll get back to them later, that I haven't forgotten about it completely. So I'm a little defensive maybe about that, or explicit now in the way that I teach. I also just think interacting with students, and it was really hard when I first went virtual teaching at Harvard Extension. It was basically like teaching by telephone, because you could only see one person at a time. And that was really hard, because trying to read a room on the phone is just really tough. So it's much easier with Zoom when you can actually make contact. I was teaching undergrads at BU when the pandemic hit, and they were all sent home with no warning. They were just told not to come back after spring break. And they were like glazed. I mean, the expressions on their faces for the 2 months after that was just horrifying. And so that was really challenging, to try to engage them and get them out of that horrible stage struck kind of mood they were in, and get them to intellectually engage was really challenging. Because I was, in the same situation that they were in. But so learning on the job, I think, is the answer there. You have to just punt. But as journalists, we know how to do that, right? Change gears.
That's right.
Oh, I thought I was going to work on this today, but in fact, I'm working on that.
Right.
So good preparation.
Any others?
Before we go, I do want to say one thing to everyone, but if you have another comment, Mark, go ahead.
I was going to ask one other quick thing. Sure. I know we're kind of at the end of the hour, but I think what I'm seeing is, now that I've actually been more involved in the science writing universe in a way since I retired than I ever was when I was on a newspaper. And one of the things I'm learning, and that's very obvious at the National Association for Science Writers, is this huge shift from traditional journalism, publications and jobs, to public information and other kinds of often university-based or corporate-based media jobs. And in years past, that's been a great source of conflict and debate. But I think you could also say that for the explanatory writing about science, the actual product may not always look so different.
Absolutely.
So what is your own thinking? I want to speak for you, but as you watch this shift occur, what are some of the thoughts that occur to you about that?
Yeah, I mean, in the old days, we used to talk about the purity of journalism, which I think that I am as impure as, by that standard, as anybody on the corporate side. We have to write. I've written stories because advertisers want, breast cancer stories in October. We're working on one now. Is that any better than, I don't see a difference between what I do really and what somebody in a comms office does, particularly if they're writing for a publication with internally. The main difference is that I don't have to get the approval of the people I'm quoting. And I try to be, to reach out beyond, the one institution. I never write a story about one institution. I'll always reach out to people beyond that. So those to me are the main differences. But in terms of the quality of the work, oftentimes is fabulous in comms departments. It's often the same people, as you said, who were in the newsroom 6 months ago or 5 years ago. And maybe there's less freedom, but sometimes, there isn't. So I think it just depends on the job.
Okay, great. Allison, back to you.
Thank you very much from all of us for joining us today and giving us this hour of your time. We really, really appreciate it. I think it was really valuable. I did also want to tell everyone on the call, AppSciComm looking for volunteers. If you have an interest in kind of helping us spread a camaraderie around the Appalachian community in terms of science writing, please reach out. We'd love to have you be on our kind of steering committee. And also wanted to let you know that next month in November, our series will continue, and we'll be having Lori Kiersey. She is kind of a health and general assignment reporter and a member of AppSciComm at the Charleston Gazette-Mail. Her story is pretty interesting in that just before the pandemic got going, she left the Gazette-Mail to be the public information officer for the county health department, which was the largest health department in West Virginia. And served in that role through much of the pandemic before actually then leaving and going back to the Gazette-Mail. So it's kind of an interesting career path, I think, and also shows that it is actually possible to come back from the quote unquote dark side. Although I really appreciate how you spoke about it, Karen, because I do think the writing quality is just as good, and there's conflicts wherever you work anymore. Yep. So and that is all. So thank you all so much for joining us. I don't know, Mark, if you want to close us out.
I just want to thank Karen again. It was terrific. It was everything and more than I expected, and I really appreciate it. And you may have been shaking a little bit. Nobody else could tell. If you hadn't have said that, nobody would have known. It was a great presentation. Yeah, the only thing I was just going to ask Allison if she could hang on the Zoom for a little bit after everybody else signed up. But thank you again so much. We really appreciate you being willing to do this.
Sure.
Okay, thanks.
Bye. Good luck, everybody.
Bye, everybody. You can hang too, Anna, if you want. Yeah. So I was just going to tell you guys. Oh, I'm sorry. You muted yourself.
Sorry, I'm on twice.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to tell you that just very belatedly this morning, I reached out to PCR at CMU, and this is so much in keeping with what we've been hearing on our feedback, but they're defunct now.
Okay.
A woman got back to me and said they just stopped meeting during the pandemic. All their leaders graduated, and they just never got another cadre of people together to kind of, and I just, it seems to be part of this bigger pattern that we're all struggling with to keep organizations viable.
Yeah. I'm actually impressed we've kept going as well as we
Yeah.
We weren't really set up for failure on this one, but hey, we just had Karen Weintraub. Way to go.
Yeah. That was great. And the one thing I feel bad about is that I just I had one of the last emails I got from that group.
We're still recording. Geez, let me stop.
Oh, geez, that's okay. I don't think I said anything.
Oh, I got to do it on my
actionable.
No, I don't think either of us said anything. Just give me a back here to get into my phone, which is actually the host, and try to figure out how to stop recording. Hey, everybody who has made it this far in the recording, you can stop listening. We're not going to say anything. There we go.